The Hells Angels biker saw the little girl brush dust off a locked crate, and its contents destroyed the story he'd believed for years. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's dive into today's story. It was a cold, foggy morning in the middle of winter when Jake, a grizzled Hells Angels biker, was riding down a long, deserted road. The crunch of his motorcycle's tires against the snow was the only sound breaking the silence. He had been on the road for hours, the wind biting at his face, his leather jacket keeping the chill at bay. His mind was a haze, consumed by the thoughts of the past, his regrets, and the mistakes that led him to this solitary life. But all of that was about to change. Just as he was about to pass an old, dilapidated house on the outskirts of town, something caught his eye. A small figure, no more than 8 years old, was kneeling in the snow by a wooden crate. The girl was brushing off the dust, her tiny hands moving with determination. Jake's instincts screamed at him to keep moving. But something about the way she was working so intently on the crate made him slow down. He pulled his bike to a stop, the rumbling of the engine echoing in the quiet air. As he dismounted, his boots crunching in the snow, he watched the girl for a moment longer. She was focused, oblivious to his presence. There was something strangely mesmerizing about her. She was no older than his niece, and yet there she was, uncovering something in the dirt that could change everything. "Hey kid, what are you doing?" Jake called out, his rough voice breaking the stillness. The little girl looked up, startled. Her wide eyes met his for a moment, and she seemed to hesitate. "I'm cleaning this crate," she said, her voice small but firm. "I think there's something inside." Jake took a few steps closer, peering at the crate. It was an old wooden box, weathered by years of exposure to the elements. The locks were rusted, but the box had an air of mystery about it, one that intrigued him despite himself. "Aren't you supposed to be inside, kid? It's too cold out here," Jake said, his tone softer than usual. She shook her head, brushing more snow off the box. "My grandma told me to stay out of the house for a bit. I wanted to see what was inside." Jake knelt down beside her, noticing how carefully she handled the crate. There was a sense of urgency in her movements, as if the box held the answers to something important. "You know it's dangerous to be out here alone," Jake said, his voice laced with concern. "What if something happens?" The girl paused and glanced up at him. "I'm not afraid," she replied simply. Jake felt a strange pull in his chest, but before he could respond, the girl managed to pry open the box. As the lid creaked, a faint light seemed to shimmer inside the crate. Jake's breath caught in his throat as he saw what lay within. It wasn't just dust and old belongings like he'd expected. No, this was something much more. The contents of the crate were far more than anyone could have imagined. Papers, photographs, and objects that had been hidden away for years, things that were meant to stay buried in the past. As Jake examined the items, a flood of memories hit him like a wave. The photographs weren't just random. They were from his own life, his own past, a past he had long since buried. His hand trembled as he picked up a faded photograph, the image of a younger version of himself staring back at him from the page. "No, this can't be," Jake muttered under his breath. The girl watched him closely, her eyes wide with curiosity, but also with a sense of understanding. She had found something that Jake had long tried to forget. The discovery of the crate had shattered everything he thought he knew about his past. He had always believed his history was his alone, something he could keep hidden. But now, standing in front of this little girl, everything had changed. The past was coming back to claim him. The photo in Jake's hand felt like it weighed a ton, as though the past was forcing its way into his present, demanding to be recognized. His mind raced as he stared at the image, unable to shake the feeling that everything he thought he knew about his life had just crumbled. The girl, who had been so eager to show him the contents of the crate, stood quietly by his side, watching his every move. Her innocent curiosity made Jake's chest tighten. He hadn't realized how much he had buried until now, how many pieces of himself were locked away, and now they were all tumbling out in front of this little girl who had no idea of the storm she had just unleashed. He looked down at the photograph again, himself, much younger, standing in front of a house that was no longer in existence. His face was filled with a mixture of pride and innocence, something he hadn't seen in years. The house behind him was the place he had grown up, the place he had sworn to forget after everything fell apart. That house had burned down years ago in a fire that Jake never truly understood, a fire that was never fully investigated, and one that haunted him in the quiet moments when he let his guard down. But there it was, a reminder that the past was always lurking, waiting to strike. "Who's that?" The girl's voice broke through Jake's thoughts, and he looked down at her, her eyes wide with curiosity. That's me," he said, his voice barely a whisper. He swallowed hard, fighting back the flood of emotions that threatened to overwhelm him. The girl nodded, but Jake could see the confusion in her eyes. "But why do you look sad?" she asked, her tone innocent, yet piercing. Jake didn't have an answer for her, not one that made sense. "Sometimes, the past, it's not easy to look at," he muttered, glancing away. He put the photograph back in the crate, but his mind was still fixated on the memory of that house, that fire, and everything that had happened afterward. The girl tilted her head, watching him, sensing that something was off. "Are you okay?" she asked. Jake took a deep breath and tried to shake off the unease. "Yeah," he said, forcing a smile. "Just memories." He turned his attention back to the crate. As he reached for the next item, inside, his fingers brushed against a cold metal object. It was a small, rusted key, and the moment his fingers closed around it, a chill ran down his spine. He stared at the key for a long moment, wondering what it opened, wondering what it had to do with the fire that had destroyed so much of his past. The girl was still watching him, her eyes filled with quiet expectation. "What's that?" she asked, her voice a little softer now, sensing the shift in Jake's mood. "I don't know," Jake replied, his voice thick with tension. He slipped the key into his pocket, determined to figure out what it unlocked, but a part of him was afraid to find out. He looked at the girl again. "I'm not sure this is something you should be involved in," he said, his voice low. The girl raised an eyebrow, her face serious. "I can help," she said. Jake's heart clenched. There was something about the girl's determination that reminded him of someone from his past, someone who had been just as brave, just as innocent, but had been swept up by forces beyond their control. Jake stood up, brushing the snow off his knees. "You need to go home," he said, his tone firm. "This is not a game." But the girl didn't move. She stood her ground, her small figure unwavering. "I'm not afraid," she said softly, her eyes fixed on Jake with a surprising intensity. Jake hesitated. He wanted to argue, to tell her to leave it alone, but he couldn't shake the feeling that she was a part of something bigger than he could understand. Maybe she was right. Maybe she could help. "Fine," Jake said, his voice softening. "But you stay out of trouble, understand?" The girl smiled up at him, her innocence untouched by the weight of the secrets they were about to uncover. "I promise," she said, and Jake believed her. As they turned away from the crate, the snow continued to fall around them, the silence thick with anticipation. Jake knew that what they had just discovered was only the beginning. The key in his pocket felt heavier now, as though it was calling to him, urging him to unlock whatever secrets had been hidden for so long. And for the first time in years, Jake felt a flicker of hope, a spark that he hadn't felt in a long time. Maybe this time, he would uncover the truth. Maybe, just maybe, it would set him free. The key in Jake's pocket felt as if it were burning through his jeans, its presence heavy, a constant reminder of the secrets he had just unearthed. He and the girl stood at the edge of the yard, snow gently falling around them as the world seemed to stand still. The girl's innocent expression had shifted, replaced by a quiet determination that unnerved Jake. She had no idea what they were getting into, no understanding of the dangers that lurked just below the surface. But Jake, for the first time in a long while, felt like he was on the edge of something important, something that could change everything. He turned back to the crate, half expecting it to hold something else, but it was empty now. He pulled the key from his pocket, the cold metal gleaming in the fading light of the day. "What's next?" the girl asked, her voice soft, but with a weight to it that caught Jake off guard. "We find out what this key opens," Jake said, more to himself than to her. "But we're not doing it here. Let's get to the garage." The girl nodded, following him as they walked back toward the old, abandoned structure. The garage was a relic from another time, its walls stained with grease and rust, the windows long since clouded with age. It was a place Jake had tried to escape from, but it had always called him back. He didn't know why. Maybe it was because the garage, like him, had a history, one full of pain, of loss, and of memories best forgotten. As they approached, Jake felt the weight of the past settle on his shoulders. The girl, however, seemed unfazed by the dilapidated surroundings. She walked with purpose, her small hands stuffed in her jacket pockets, looking around with a curiosity that bordered on fearless. They reached the door of the garage, and Jake pulled out the rusty key. He hesitated for a moment before sliding it into the lock. The sound of the metal turning echoed in the empty space, and for a second, Jake wondered if he was making a mistake. But it was too late to turn back now. With a creak, the door opened, revealing the dim, cluttered interior. "This is where I work," Jake said, trying to sound casual, but his voice betrayed him. The girl stepped inside first, her eyes taking in the mess of tools, parts, and old equipment scattered around the room. It was a world of chaos, but to Jake, it was home. The girl walked over to an old workbench in the corner, where a few unfinished projects lay waiting. She ran her fingers across a half-finished motorcycle engine, her brow furrowed in concentration. Jake watched her for a moment, then turned his attention back to the matter at hand. "I don't know what's in this," Jake said, more to himself than to the girl. He had always been good at fixing things, at building things from nothing, but this felt different. This felt like opening a door to something far more dangerous than a broken bike. "I don't know what it unlocks, but I have a feeling it's important." The girl turned to face him, her expression unreadable. "What do you think it is?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Jake paused, considering her question. The answer, however, was too complicated, too wrapped up in his own past to explain easily. Instead, he focused on the task at hand, the overwhelming need to uncover the truth. He walked over to a dusty, old cabinet in the back of the room. "Let's see if this works," he said, inserting the key into the lock. The metal clicked, and with a little effort, the door creaked open. Inside was a collection of old, forgotten documents. Papers, letters, and photographs, each one yellowed with age. Jake pulled out the first one he could reach, the brittle paper crackling in his hands as he unfolded it. His heart skipped a beat when he saw what it was, an old, faded letter addressed to him. His name was scribbled across the top, but the handwriting was unfamiliar, foreign. He read the first few lines, his mind racing as he processed the words. It was a letter from someone he had long forgotten, someone who had been a part of his past, a part he had tried to bury. The letter spoke of family secrets, of betrayals, and of things that had been kept hidden for far too long. Jake's hand trembled as he held the letter, the weight of it sinking in. This was it. This was the thing he had been avoiding, the thing he had been running from. And now, it was right in front of him. The girl stepped closer, her curiosity piqued. "What does it say?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Jake looked at her for a moment, his mind spinning. "It's from someone I thought was gone," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Someone who had a hand in everything that happened to me." The girl's eyes widened, but she said nothing. Jake folded the letter carefully and placed it back into the cabinet, then closed the door. He stood there for a moment, the weight of the truth pressing down on him. He had always known there was more to the story, more to his past, but he had never expected it to come rushing back like this. He turned to face the girl. "This is bigger than I thought," he said, his voice steady, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes, fear, maybe, or perhaps something worse. "We need to figure out who's behind this, and why they kept it from me for so long." The girl nodded, her face serious now. "What do we do next?" Jake took a deep breath. "We keep looking. There's more to uncover, and I'm not stopping until I find the truth." As Jake stood there, staring at the documents that were once hidden away, the weight of his past settled like a thick fog around him. The girl, still standing at the far side of the room, hadn't said a word since he opened the cabinet. She had been watching him closely, sensing the turmoil within him but not quite understanding its depth. Jake, however, couldn't ignore the growing feeling in his gut, the feeling that the deeper he dug into this, the more dangerous it would become. But there was no turning back now. He could feel the past calling to him, pulling him in with an urgency he couldn't shake. The letter, the key, the crate, it was all connected, and Jake had a sinking feeling that the truth would be more than he was prepared for. The girl finally spoke, her voice soft yet full of the same determination that had carried her through the snow earlier that day. "What are you going to do now?" she asked. Jake turned his gaze to her, surprised by how much she had grown in his mind since this all started. She was just a kid, yet she had the courage to stand beside him in the face of something so much bigger than either of them. He took a deep breath. "We're going to figure this out," he said, his voice steady, though inside, his thoughts were anything but. He wasn't sure where to begin. He had to go through everything. Every letter, every photograph, every piece of information that could help him piece together what was happening. But it wasn't just about the past anymore. It was about protecting the girl, about keeping her out of whatever mess he was about to uncover. He could see the curiosity in her eyes, a quiet need to know more, but he couldn't let her get involved. "Not in this. I need to go through these papers," Jake said, his tone a bit more firm now. "I don't want you here while I do." The girl's brow furrowed in confusion, but she didn't argue. "I understand," she said, her voice unexpectedly mature for her age. As Jake sifted through the papers, he couldn't help but feel like a man digging his own grave. Each letter, each photograph, revealed more about a past he wasn't ready to face, stories of betrayal, deception, and a family that had abandoned him when he needed them the most. His fingers trembled as he picked up one of the photos, a younger version of his mother, her eyes full of hope. It was hard to reconcile the woman in the photo with the one who had left him behind. The memories came rushing back, memories of a time before everything had fallen apart, before the fire, before the Hells Angels, before he had become the man he was now. As Jake continued to go through the papers, he found something that made his blood run cold. A map. It wasn't just any map, though. It was a map of the very area he was in now, marked with strange symbols and notes in the margins. This was no coincidence. Whoever had left this for him wanted him to find it. But why? What was the significance of this map? And why had it been hidden away for so long? The girl, sensing the tension in the air, walked over to Jake's side. "What's that?" she asked, her voice filled with curiosity and something else, concern, maybe. Jake hesitated for a moment, not wanting to involve her, but he knew it was too late. She was already part of this, whether he liked it or not. "I don't know yet," he said, his voice tight. "But it's not good." He rolled the map up carefully, as though it might explode if he handled it wrong. "I'm going to have to find out what this means." He stood up, the weight of the map heavy in his hands. The girl watched him, her eyes full of questions, but she didn't ask. She simply followed him as he moved toward the door. Jake glanced back at the cluttered garage, his mind racing with possibilities. Whoever had left the map for him knew things he didn't, and it was clear now that the answers were not going to be easy to find. "You need to stay here," Jake said to the girl, his voice firm but gentle. "It's not safe for you to come with me." The girl didn't argue. She simply nodded and watched as Jake walked out of the garage, the map clutched tightly in his hand. As he stepped into the cold, biting wind, Jake felt the weight of his past pressing down on him. But this time, he wasn't going to run. This time, he was going to face whatever lay ahead. The girl may have opened the door to the past, but Jake was the one who had to walk through it. And whatever secrets awaited him on the other side, he was ready to confront them. Jake's heart raced as he thought about what he had just discovered. This wasn't just about uncovering the truth. This was about survival, his, the girl's, and everyone else caught in the web of lies he was about to unravel. The cold wind cut through Jake's leather jacket as he walked down the snow-covered street, the weight of the map in his hand feeling heavier with every step. He had just stepped into something far bigger than he ever anticipated. The more he uncovered, the more dangerous the path ahead seemed. The girl's innocent curiosity had opened a door to his past he wasn't ready to walk through, but now it was too late to turn back. He needed answers, and they were locked away in the secrets of the past, secrets that could destroy everything he'd worked to build. Jake paused at the end of the street, glancing around. The houses were quiet, the street empty, as if the whole town was holding its breath. He had learned over the years how to be cautious, how to move in the shadows. But the truth was, he wasn't sure what he was walking into. There were too many pieces missing, too many unknowns. He stuffed the map into his jacket and started walking again, his boots crunching in the snow. His mind kept circling back to that moment in the garage, when the girl had asked him what was in the crate. Her innocent question had set everything in motion, but now it was his responsibility to protect her. He didn't know who to trust anymore. The past had a way of sneaking up on you when you least expected it. And Jake had a feeling that whoever had left the map behind wasn't going to make it easy for him to find the truth. As he approached the edge of town, a dark thought crept into his mind. What if the people who had been involved in his past weren't finished with him yet? What if they were still watching, waiting for him to make a move? Jake quickened his pace, his instincts telling him that he wasn't alone. He reached the outskirts of town and glanced over his shoulder. The streets were still empty, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The hairs on the back of his neck stood on end as he approached an old, abandoned warehouse. It was the perfect place for a meeting, isolated, hidden from the eyes of the public. As Jake stepped inside, he could hear the faint sound of voices in the distance. He stopped, pressing his back against the wall, trying to make himself as invisible as possible. He strained his ears, listening for anything that might give him a clue about what was happening. The voices grew louder, and Jake realized that they were coming from inside the warehouse. Slowly, he moved toward the source of the sound, his boots silent on the cold concrete floor. When he reached the doorway, he stopped and peered inside. There, in the center of the warehouse, stood 3 men, strangers to him. They were speaking in low tones, their faces obscured by the shadows. Jake's heart began to race. He had to find out what they were discussing. He stepped closer, trying to stay out of sight. The words he overheard made his blood run cold. They were talking about him, about his past. They knew things he thought only he remembered. Jake's pulse quickened as he heard the name of the man who had betrayed him all those years ago. The man who had left him for dead. The man who had caused the fire that destroyed everything Jake had known. Jake clenched his fists, fighting the urge to burst into the room and confront them. But he knew better. He had to play this carefully. These men were connected to the same people who had tried to erase him from the picture. And now they were connected to the girl, whether they realized it or not. He backed away from the doorway, his mind racing. He needed to make a plan, but more than that, he needed to protect the girl. He couldn't let her get caught in the middle of this. As Jake turned to leave the warehouse, a voice called out from behind him. "You've been following us, haven't you?" Jake froze, his hand instinctively reaching for the knife at his waist. The voice was calm, too calm. Jake didn't turn around. "I haven't followed anyone," he said, his voice low and steady. The sound of footsteps echoed behind him as someone approached. Jake didn't know how many were there, but he could feel the presence of someone closing in. "We know who you are," the voice said again, "and we know what you're after. The question is, what are you going to do about it?" Jake didn't answer. He simply kept walking, his eyes scanning the shadows for any sign of movement. His mind was focused on one thing, getting out of there alive. He didn't know how much time he had before they figured out that he was the one who had been listening in. But he couldn't afford to make a mistake. Not now. He finally reached the street, the cold air hitting his face like a slap. His heart was still pounding, his mind racing. He didn't know what the men had planned, but he had a feeling they were only the beginning. He had to find the girl. He had to protect her from whatever was coming. As Jake made his way back toward the town, he couldn't shake the feeling that everything was about to change. His past was catching up with him, and there was no running from it. But he wouldn't go down without a fight. He couldn't, not when there was so much at stake. The night was colder than Jake had anticipated, and the bitter wind sliced through his jacket as he made his way back toward the abandoned garage. His mind was still racing, the weight of the situation pressing down on him harder with each step. The men in the warehouse, the ones who had mentioned his past, had left him with a sense of urgency. He needed to find the girl. He needed to get her out of there before things went any further. The girl's face flashed in his mind, and he felt a pang of guilt. He should have kept her out of this. She was just a kid. He shouldn't have let her get involved. But now, there was no turning back. He knew he couldn't protect her from the truth forever, but he had to try. As he walked past the empty streets of the town, his thoughts were interrupted by the sound of tires crunching against snow. He turned quickly, his heart pounding in his chest. A dark SUV was slowly making its way down the street, the headlights casting long shadows across the snow. Jake froze, instinctively stepping into the shadows of an old building. His first thought was that the men from the warehouse had followed him. His second thought was that he was probably out of time. He waited, watching as the SUV slowed to a stop in front of the house where the girl had been staying. His grip tightened on the knife at his waist. This wasn't just a coincidence. The car was too well timed. Someone knew where she was. Someone was already ahead of him. The door of the SUV opened, and a tall figure stepped out, dressed in dark clothing. Jake didn't need to see his face to know that this man was dangerous. The way he moved, with the kind of purpose that only comes from experience, told Jake everything he needed to know. This was no ordinary man. This was someone connected to the same people who had been pulling strings in his life for years. Jake stepped out from the shadows, silently moving closer. His breath was shallow, his every sense on high alert. He couldn't let them get to the girl first. He had to move fast. As the man walked toward the door of the house, Jake quickly crossed the street, staying low. His pulse was pounding in his ears, but he focused on the task at hand. He needed to get to the girl, to make sure she was safe before this man, or whoever else was involved, had a chance to hurt her. The closer Jake got, the more he realized just how badly he had underestimated the situation. This wasn't just about his past anymore. This was about protecting someone who was innocent, someone who had no idea what kind of danger she was in. He reached the front yard of the house just as the man knocked on the door. Jake moved to the side of the house, his back pressed against the cold exterior, listening intently. The door creaked open, and Jake could hear muffled voices coming from inside. He couldn't make out the words, but the tone was tense, urgent. The man stepped inside, and the door clicked shut behind him. Jake didn't waste a second. He moved to the window on the side of the house, carefully peering inside. What he saw made his heart drop into his stomach. The girl was standing in the living room, her arms crossed tightly in front of her, her face pale and worried. She didn't look scared, but she looked confused, like she wasn't sure what was happening. And the man, he wasn't speaking to her like a friend. Jake could tell from the way he stood, from the way he loomed over her, that he wasn't there to help. He was there to control, to manipulate. Jake's jaw clenched in anger. This had gone too far. He couldn't let this man hurt her, no matter who he was. Without thinking, Jake moved around to the back of the house, finding an old side door. It wasn't locked. He pushed it open slowly, stepping into the dimly lit hallway. The house smelled faintly of dust and old wood, but Jake barely noticed. He was focused entirely on the girl and the man in the next room. He crept down the hallway, his steps light and careful. He had to get to her before things escalated. As he reached the living room door, he could hear their conversation more clearly. The man's voice was low and threatening. "You don't know who you're dealing with, kid," the man said. "You don't get to decide who's in charge here. I'm not leaving without you." Jake's blood ran cold. He couldn't let this go on any longer. He took a deep breath and pushed the door open. The man turned in surprise as Jake stepped into the room, the sound of the door creaking behind him. "I think it's time for you to leave," Jake said, his voice calm but filled with authority. The man sized him up, his eyes narrowing. "You're making a mistake," he said. "You have no idea who you're dealing with." Jake didn't flinch. "I know exactly who you are," he said, his voice steady. "And I'm not letting you hurt her." The man's eyes flicked to the girl, and Jake could see the recognition in his face. "You think you're going to protect her?" he sneered. "You don't know anything about her. About what's coming." Jake stepped forward, his hand reaching for the knife at his waist, but before he could act, the man lunged at him, knocking him off balance. The girl screamed, but Jake barely heard it. His focus was entirely on the man in front of him. The struggle was quick but intense, each move more desperate than the last. Jake managed to throw the man off, landing a punch that sent him sprawling onto the floor. For a moment, everything was still. Then, the man stood, a dark smile spreading across his face. "You've made a big mistake," he said, his voice dripping with menace. But Jake wasn't backing down. Not this time. Not when everything was at stake. The man's sneer spread wider as he wiped the blood from his lip, his eyes locked on Jake with an intensity that sent a shiver down his spine. "You don't get it, do you?" the man growled, his voice low and menacing. "You think you're saving her, but you're just a pawn in a much bigger game." Jake stood his ground, his chest heaving with the remnants of adrenaline. He wiped his own blood from his lip and steadied himself. "I'm not interested in your games. I'm interested in her safety." The girl stood frozen, her wide eyes darting between the two men, fear etched on her face. She wanted to run, but she knew she couldn't leave now. Whatever was going on between these men was bigger than her, and she needed to understand it. Jake took a deep breath, his fingers brushing the hilt of his knife, still in its sheath. The man had his hand on the back of his belt, where Jake knew there was likely a gun. The air between them crackled with tension, But Jake wasn't going to make the first move. Not yet. You don't know what you're up against, the man said again, taking a step forward. This isn't just some random encounter. This is the beginning of something you can't stop. I'll stop it when I have to, Jake replied, his voice calm but resolute. He wasn't sure what he was up against, but he knew one thing. He wasn't going to let this man, or whatever he represented, hurt the girl. He couldn't. The man gave a low laugh, almost a growl. You think you're a hero, huh? Protecting some innocent girl? He looked at the girl then, his gaze cold. She's not innocent. She's part of this, whether you like it or not. She's already involved. Jake's blood ran cold at his words, but he didn't flinch. Involved in what? He demanded, stepping closer, his eyes narrowing. The man grinned, but it wasn't a smile of victory. It was a smile of warning. You'll find out soon enough, he said. And when you do, you'll regret not letting her go. Before Jake could respond, the sound of footsteps echoed in the distance, and the man's expression shifted from amusement to urgency. I've said enough, he said, his voice tightening. This isn't over, Jake. Not by a long shot. With that, the man turned and quickly exited the house, disappearing into the darkness outside. Jake didn't move immediately. He kept his eyes on the door, his mind racing. The man had left just like that, almost as if he knew Jake wasn't going to follow him. Almost like he was daring him to chase after him, knowing Jake wouldn't get far. What did he mean? The girl asked, her voice trembling. Jake turned to face her. She looked just as confused as he felt. Her innocent face had been a reminder of everything he had fought to protect, and now it was more complicated than ever. I don't know, Jake said, his voice low. But we're going to find out. He paused for a moment, his mind running through every possibility. This wasn't just a random encounter. The man had known too much, and Jake was certain that whoever he was part of something far bigger than Jake had imagined. The girl stepped closer to him, her small hands wringing together. I don't understand, she said quietly. Why did he say that I'm involved? What does that mean? Jake swallowed hard. He hadn't wanted to tell her the truth, but there was no avoiding it. She had already been dragged into this, whether they liked it or not. He kneeled down in front of her, taking her small hands in his. I don't know yet, but I promise you this. I'm going to protect you. No matter what. You're not alone in this. The girl nodded, her eyes filled with uncertainty, but there was a flicker of trust in them. Jake had a feeling that trust would be tested before the night was over. Standing up, Jake glanced back at the door where the man had disappeared. We need to keep moving, he said, his voice firm. Get to the car. We're not safe here anymore. The girl hesitated for a moment, then nodded. She followed him as they moved toward the back door, where Jake had parked his bike earlier. As they stepped outside, the cold hit them both like a slap, but Jake was focused on the task ahead. He had no idea who the man was, but his words were clear. The girl was involved in something dangerous, something far beyond her understanding. And Jake wasn't going to let her face it alone. They reached the bike, and Jake glanced around the street, trying to assess whether anyone was watching them. He didn't see anyone, but he knew they couldn't afford to be complacent. They had to leave. Fast. The girl climbed onto the back of the bike, and Jake adjusted his helmet before starting the engine. As they rode off into the night, Jake's mind kept circling back to the man's words. You'll regret not letting her go. Jake wasn't sure what that meant, but one thing was certain. He wasn't going to let anyone take her away. Not without a fight. The sound of the motorcycle's engine echoed through the empty streets as Jake and the girl sped down the road, the cold wind whipping against their faces. The city was quiet, too quiet, and every street corner seemed to hold a shadow that could be watching them. Jake kept his eyes on the road ahead, but his mind was racing. The man from the warehouse, the cryptic message about the girl being involved, and the threats that followed, they were all starting to piece together in a way that didn't sit right with him. He had to get them both out of here, but to where? His mind kept replaying the man's words. You'll regret not letting her go. But Jake couldn't let that happen. Not after everything they had been through. The girl, still holding on tightly to his back, shifted her weight, breaking his concentration. Where are we going? She asked, her voice barely audible over the hum of the engine. Jake didn't answer immediately. He wasn't sure where to go, but he knew he couldn't stay in the same place. They needed a safe haven, a place to regroup. A place where the past couldn't find them. I don't know yet, Jake replied, his voice tight. But we're getting as far away from here as we can. The girl's silence was telling. She could feel the tension in the air, the uncertainty that clung to Jake's every word. She trusted him, but she had no idea what was coming next. She didn't need to know everything, but the way Jake was acting made her nervous. He had always been the calm one, the protector, but now he seemed on edge. They rode for miles, passing through streets that grew emptier and darker the farther they went. Jake's grip on the handlebars tightened with each mile. He couldn't shake the feeling that they were being followed. The man from the warehouse had to have told someone where they were going. Jake wasn't naive enough to think that he could outrun his past forever, and whoever was behind this wouldn't stop until they got what they wanted. "How long until we stop?" the girl asked, breaking through his thoughts. Jake looked over his shoulder at her, his eyes filled with determination. "Not long," he said. "Just hold on." He pushed the bike faster, cutting through the cold night air. The girl held on tighter, her small arms wrapped around his waist, and for a brief moment, Jake felt like he was protecting something pure, something worth saving. But that feeling was fleeting. He couldn't ignore the weight of the map in his jacket or the letter that had changed everything. Every mile they put between them and the city felt like a countdown. They couldn't run forever. They needed answers, and the only way to get them was to face whatever was waiting for them at the end of this road. Jake's mind flashed back to the photo he had seen earlier in the garage, the one that had brought everything crashing back. His younger self, standing in front of a house that no longer existed. It had been years since he thought about that house, about the fire that destroyed everything he had ever known. He thought it was all in the past, but now it seemed like the past was coming back to claim him. The girl stirred behind him, pulling him from his thoughts. "Jake," she said softly, "do you think we'll be okay?" Jake hesitated, his heart heavy. He couldn't promise her that everything would be fine. There were too many unknowns. But what he could promise was this. He wasn't going to let anyone hurt her. "I'm going to make sure you're safe," he said, his voice steady. "No matter what." The girl seemed to accept this, and for the first time in a while, she relaxed slightly. Jake could hear the worry in her voice, but he could also hear the trust. She was placing her faith in him, and that was something he couldn't take lightly. The road ahead stretched into the darkness, and Jake pushed the bike even harder. He had no idea where they were headed, but wherever it was, it had to be better than where they had just come from. As they continued down the road, a sense of dread began to settle over Jake. The man from the warehouse hadn't been the only one looking for them. Someone else was watching, someone who knew exactly what was at stake. Jake's grip tightened on the handlebars as he scanned the road ahead. He wasn't going to let anyone catch up to them. Not now. Not when they were so close to finding the answers they needed. Suddenly, the headlights of a car appeared in the distance, growing brighter with every second. Jake's heart skipped a beat. He had hoped to make it further before they were spotted, but it looked like his luck had run out. He slowed the bike slightly, trying to make himself as invisible as possible. The car drew closer, its headlights cutting through the night like a spotlight. Jake couldn't see who was inside, but he knew they weren't just passing by. Whoever was in that car was here for a reason, and Jake wasn't going to stick around to find out what it was. He sped up again, his heart pounding in his chest as he leaned into the bike, pushing it faster. The car followed, its engine roaring behind them, and Jake knew they were in trouble. The girl's arms tightened around his waist as she sensed the change in speed. "What's going on?" she asked, her voice sharp with fear. "We've got company," Jake replied through gritted teeth. "Hold on tight." He could hear the car gaining on them, the engine's growl getting louder with every passing second. Whoever was in that car wasn't going to stop until they caught them, and Jake wasn't sure how much longer he could keep outrunning them. The girl's grip on him tightened, but there was nothing more she could do. Jake had to handle this. He had to keep them both safe. The sound of the car's engine behind them was deafening, and Jake knew the time for running was almost up. He needed to make a stand. And fast. The roar of the engine behind them was growing louder, and Jake could feel the heat of the pursuit closing in. His instincts were on overdrive now, every muscle in his body tense, his mind racing through every possible escape route. He was no stranger to being chased, but this time was different. He wasn't just running from his past, he was running with someone else's life on the line. The girl's grip on him tightened, and Jake could feel her fear seeping through, but he had no time to comfort her. They had to keep moving. The headlights of the car were like a spotlight, illuminating the road behind them as it gained ground. Jake swerved slightly, trying to throw off their pursuers, but the car stayed right on their tail. The speed was pushing the bike to its limits, the engine screaming under the strain. The girl's small body was pressed against his back, and for a moment, he could feel the steady rhythm of her breath against him, matching his own rapid heartbeat. "Jake, what's happening?" she asked, her voice trembling. He didn't have an answer for her, not one that would make sense. He couldn't afford to explain everything now, not when they were being hunted. "Just hold on," he yelled, his voice cutting through the wind. The car was almost there now, just a few feet behind them. Jake could see the shadow of the driver in the rearview mirror, their face obscured, but their intentions clear. They weren't just trying to catch up, they were going to force them off the road. Jake's heart pounded in his chest as the road ahead twisted, narrowing into a sharp turn. He had only one shot at this. He had to make the turn and lose them in the darkness. The car wasn't going to give up. He could see it now, closing in fast, the headlights blinding him. Jake leaned into the turn, pushing the bike to its limit. The girl screamed, her arms tightening around his waist, but Jake kept his focus. This was it. He had to make it. The bike shot around the corner, and for a moment, it felt like time slowed down. He could hear the screech of tires as the car tried to make the turn, but it was too late. The bike was already ahead, speeding through the dark stretch of road, the car left behind in the dust. But Jake didn't slow down. He couldn't afford to. He kept pushing the bike harder, the wind howling in his ears. The girl was quiet now, but he could still feel her holding on to him, her fear radiating through the tight grip on his waist. He knew they had bought themselves some time, but not enough. The man chasing them wouldn't stop, and Jake couldn't afford to think about what would happen if they got caught. His eyes scanned the road ahead. There was nothing but darkness. No sign of any other cars, no other signs of life. Just the stretch of road that seemed to go on forever. They had to get to safety. They had to find a place to hide. Jake's mind raced through options, but none of them seemed safe enough. He couldn't go back to the garage. The house was too close to where they had been. They needed to get out of the area. He glanced over his shoulder and saw the headlights of the car reappearing in the distance. They had caught up again. But this time, Jake had a plan. He pulled the bike onto a narrow side road, one that led off the main highway. The tires crunched against the gravel as he made the turn, the bike leaning into the curve. The car's headlights remained a constant threat in the rearview, but Jake knew this was their best shot. They could lose them in the twists and turns of this road. If they could just get far enough ahead, they might be able to find shelter. The road grew more rugged, the gravel shifting beneath the tires, but Jake didn't slow down. The car wasn't far behind now, but Jake could tell it was struggling to keep up on the uneven surface. It was a matter of seconds before they would be out of range. Jake's heart was in his throat as he pushed the bike faster, weaving in and out of the curves. The headlights were starting to fade, but he couldn't afford to let up now. They had to get completely out of sight. The girl was silent behind him, and he knew she was scared. He didn't know how much longer he could keep this up. His body was starting to feel the strain, his muscles aching from the tension, but he couldn't afford to stop. Finally, the headlights of the car disappeared from view. Jake's breath caught in his throat as he made another turn, taking them deeper into the forested area, where the trees closed in around the narrow road. He slowed the bike just enough to navigate the winding path, his mind still racing. They were safe, for now, but the feeling of relief didn't last long. Jake knew this was far from over. Whoever was behind them would keep coming. They wouldn't stop until they had what they wanted. He wasn't sure what that was, but he had a feeling the answer was hidden in those old papers, the map, and the cryptic words from the man. Jake glanced over his shoulder one last time. The road behind them was empty now. For a moment, everything felt still, quiet. They had made it. But as he looked ahead, the uncertainty of the future weighed heavily on him. He couldn't rest. Not until he figured out what was really going on, and why the girl was involved in this dangerous game. He glanced at her, her face pale from fear, but her eyes still wide with curiosity. She was stronger than he had realized, and that thought gave him a small bit of hope. They had survived this far. Maybe, just maybe, they could make it through the rest of this. But Jake knew one thing for sure. This was only the beginning. The wind had calmed as Jake navigated the narrow forest road, the headlights of his motorcycle the only source of light in the pitch-black night. He had managed to shake off the car that had been tailing them, but he knew it wasn't over. They hadn't lost them for good. It was just a matter of time before the chase resumed. Jake glanced over his shoulder at the girl, who was now sitting stiffly behind him. She was silent, but he could feel her eyes on his back, full of unspoken questions. He didn't blame her for being confused. Hell, he was just as confused as she was. The mystery surrounding the map, the cryptic warnings, and the man's threatening words. It was all too much to process. Jake took a sharp turn, the tires of the bike kicking up gravel. The path was getting rougher, but he didn't care. His mind was focused on one thing: keeping them safe. He needed to find a place to lay low, somewhere they could regroup and figure out their next move. They couldn't stay on the road for much longer. "Jake, where are we going?" the girl asked, her voice soft but filled with concern. He could tell she was scared, but she was trying not to show it. He could see the tension in her shoulders, the way her hands gripped his waist, as if holding on for dear life. "We're just getting to a safer spot," Jake replied, his voice calm but firm. "We'll figure things out there." The girl didn't respond, but Jake could feel the weight of her worry pressing into his back. They rode for what felt like hours, the silence between them only broken by the hum of the bike and the occasional rustling of the trees. Eventually, the road began to widen, and Jake saw the faint outline of a small cabin up ahead. It wasn't much, but it would have to do. He could only hope that no one had already found it. As they pulled up to the cabin, Jake stopped the bike and dismounted. He helped the girl off, noticing how she immediately took a step back, looking around cautiously. Jake wasn't sure what she was thinking, but he could tell she was as on edge as he was. He walked up to the door of the cabin and tested the handle. To his relief, it opened easily. He stepped inside, the smell of musty wood and dust greeting him as he flicked on a light. It wasn't much, just a small, one-room cabin with a few pieces of old furniture and a fireplace, but it was enough for now. "It's not much," Jake said, glancing over his shoulder at the girl. "But it'll be safe for a while." She nodded, but Jake could see the uncertainty in her eyes. She didn't trust him yet, not fully. And why should she? He had promised to keep her safe, but the truth was, he didn't know what the hell was going on himself. He was just winging it. "Jake." The girl's voice was hesitant as she spoke. "What's really going on? Who are these people chasing us?" Jake ran a hand through his hair, looking around the cabin as if searching for the right words. "I wish I could tell you," he said, his voice strained. "But I don't have the answers yet. All I know is that they're not done with us. Whoever they are, they've got something they want, and we're caught up in it." The girl didn't say anything, but her eyes were wide, full of fear and confusion. Jake could see she was trying to process everything, trying to make sense of the chaos they'd been thrown into. "But you're not alone in this," Jake added, his voice softening. "I'll protect you, no matter what. That's the one thing I can promise." The girl looked at him, her gaze searching his face. For a moment, Jake thought she might say something, but then she just nodded, her expression unreadable. She was still scared, still unsure, but she was trusting him. And that was all Jake needed right now. He walked over to the small table in the corner of the cabin and began unpacking the bag he had grabbed from the garage. It wasn't much, just a few essentials, but it would get them through the night. He pulled out the map he had taken earlier, spreading it out on the table. The markings on it were still unclear, but Jake was certain they held the key to everything. He traced his finger over the path outlined on the map, trying to make sense of it. But nothing about this felt right. It was like someone had designed this whole thing to mess with his head, to pull him deeper into a game he didn't understand. As he stared at the map, the girl came up behind him. "What's this?" she asked quietly, peering over his shoulder. Jake hesitated for a moment before answering. "It's a map," he said, though he knew it was more than that. "I think it's connected to everything. My past, your past. This is where the answers are." The girl studied the map with him, her brow furrowed as she traced the lines with her finger. Jake could see she was trying to understand it, trying to put together the pieces. But he could tell she wasn't getting the full picture. She didn't have the history he had, the memories that were tied to the places on this map. For her, this was just a puzzle she couldn't solve. And Jake couldn't blame her. He didn't have all the answers either. As they sat in silence, the reality of the situation began to settle in. They were running, and for all Jake's promises, he didn't know how long he could keep this up. Whoever was after them wouldn't stop until they got what they wanted. And Jake wasn't sure he had the strength to fight back anymore. He glanced at the girl one last time, his mind weighing the possibilities. "We'll leave at first light," he said, breaking the silence. "We need to stay one step ahead." The girl nodded again, but there was something in her eyes that Jake couldn't place. A spark of understanding, maybe, or something more. He couldn't tell. But whatever it was, Jake had a feeling it was only a matter of time before they both found out just how deep this rabbit hole went. The first light of dawn barely broke through the trees as Jake prepared to leave the cabin. He had barely slept, his mind too occupied with everything that had happened, everything that was coming. The girl was still asleep on the couch, her body curled up under a heavy blanket, her breathing steady and peaceful. For a moment, Jake watched her, feeling a pang of guilt. She shouldn't be caught up in this mess. She was just a kid, and yet, somehow, she was entangled in his past, dragged into a world of danger that was never meant for her. He turned his attention back to the maps spread out on the table. The markings had begun to make sense, but the more Jake stared at them, the more he realized just how much he didn't know. His past, the people involved, the cryptic messages, it was all leading to something, but he wasn't sure what that was yet. The only thing he was sure of was that whoever was behind this, whoever was chasing them, wouldn't stop. Jake ran his fingers over the map again, tracing the path, wondering if there was something he had missed. The road ahead was uncertain, filled with more questions than answers. But there was no time to waste. He needed to get the girl out of here, keep her safe. He had promised her that he would protect her, and he couldn't afford to break that promise. As he folded the map and tucked it into his jacket pocket, the sound of movement behind him caught his attention. The girl had woken up, and her tired eyes met his. "Jake, are we leaving already?" she asked, her voice hoarse from sleep. Jake nodded, offering her a small smile. "Yeah, we need to keep moving." He walked over to her, helping her up from the couch. She stood slowly, her legs stiff from the uncomfortable position she had slept in. "I know this is a lot to take in," Jake said, his voice softer now, "but we can't stay here. We need to get to a place where we can figure this out." The girl didn't argue. She simply nodded, her expression serious. There was a quiet understanding between them now, a bond forged in the uncertainty and danger they both faced. "I'm ready," she said, her voice steady, though there was still a trace of fear there. Jake gave her a reassuring nod before they both made their way outside. The morning air was crisp and cold, and Jake could feel the weight of the world on his shoulders. He had no idea what they were walking into, but he knew one thing. They had to keep moving. They couldn't let their guard down. As they walked to the bike, Jake took one last look around the cabin. It was a brief moment of peace, but it didn't last long. He knew they couldn't stay in one place for too long. The world outside had already started closing in on them. He started the engine and looked back at the girl, who had climbed onto the back. "Ready?" he asked. She nodded, and they were off. As they drove down the winding road, Jake kept his eyes on the rearview mirror, watching for any sign that they were being followed. The landscape blurred around them, the miles ticking by, but the nagging feeling in his chest wouldn't go away. He couldn't shake the sense that they were being watched. Every turn, every stop, it felt like someone was always a step behind them. The road stretched on, the sun creeping higher in the sky, but it was hard to shake the feeling that they were running out of time. After a while, the familiar hum of the motorcycle filled the air, the rhythm of the road becoming a temporary distraction. Jake could feel the girl's grip tightening around his waist as they rode, her body pressed close against his. He didn't know where they were going, but he knew they couldn't stop until they found answers. "Jake," the girl's voice broke through his thoughts, "do you think they'll catch us?" Her question was simple, but it held so much more. Jake didn't want to answer it, didn't want to admit the truth. But he had to. "I don't know," he said honestly. "But I'm not going to let that happen. We'll keep moving, keep staying one step ahead. We have to." The girl didn't reply, but Jake could feel her nodding behind him. There was a quiet strength in her now, something that had shifted since their first meeting. She wasn't just a scared kid anymore. She was becoming a part of this, just as much as he was. As they continued down the road, the silence between them grew, but it wasn't uncomfortable. They were both thinking, processing the weight of the situation. Jake could feel the pressure building, but he couldn't afford to focus on it. Not yet. He had to stay ahead, had to keep them safe. The road ahead began to narrow as they left the town behind. The familiar signs of civilization faded, replaced by dense trees and rolling hills. They were getting closer to the edge of the map, the place Jake had marked in his mind as the next step. It felt like the right place to go, but the closer they got, the more Jake realized that they weren't just running from their past. They were walking straight into the heart of it. As they rode, the first signs of trouble appeared. A car appeared behind them, its headlights piercing the quiet of the morning. Jake's heart skipped a beat as he watched it gaining on them. This wasn't a coincidence. They were being followed again. Jake swore under his breath, urging the bike forward. He couldn't let the girl see the fear that was creeping up on him. He had promised her safety, and he wasn't going to let anyone take that away. He pushed the bike harder, taking sharp turns, trying to lose the car in the winding roads. The girl's grip tightened again, but she didn't say anything. She didn't need to. She trusted him. But Jake knew the chase wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The sound of the car's engine grew louder, echoing in Jake's ears as the vehicle closed the distance between them. His grip on the handlebars tightened, his knuckles white, and he could feel the familiar tension in his chest rising again. This time, they weren't just being followed, they were being hunted. The girl behind him shifted slightly, her grip tightening around his waist, but she didn't speak. Jake could feel the anxiety in her, but she trusted him to get them out of this. He had to. There was no way they could outrun the car on these winding roads, not with the terrain getting steeper and the roads narrowing even more. They had to get ahead. He revved the engine, pushing the bike harder, the sound of the motorcycle drowning out everything else. The forest around them blurred as they sped through the hills, the trees giving way to open fields ahead. It was risky. He couldn't afford to crash, but he had no other choice. If they kept going at this speed, the car would catch up within minutes. And Jake wasn't about to let that happen. "Hold on," he yelled over his shoulder, not sure if the girl heard him over the wind and the roar of the engine. He leaned into another sharp turn, cutting the bike close to the edge of the road. The car was still behind them, but it was having trouble keeping up with the bike's agility. Jake's plan was simple: outrun them through the curves, use the speed to lose them in the twists. It was a risky gamble, but it was the only chance they had. As they approached a particularly sharp bend, Jake's heart raced. The car was too close now, the headlights blinding in the rear view. He had to make the turn perfectly, or they'd be caught. He leaned into the turn harder than before, the tires skidding slightly on the gravel. The bike jerked, but Jake fought to keep it steady. The girl gasped, her arms tightening around him, but she didn't say anything. She knew the stakes. The bike shot around the corner, the gravel spraying behind them, and Jake could feel the momentum carrying them forward. But the car was still on their tail, and it was only a matter of time before it caught up. The road straightened ahead, but Jake could see that the car had started to make up ground. There was no more time to waste. They had to make a break for it. "We're almost there," Jake muttered to himself. He was talking more to steady his nerves than to reassure the girl. Just a little more. Up ahead, Jake saw a narrow path leading off the road, a small dirt trail that cut through the trees. It was a long shot, but if he could make it onto that trail, they could hide. The car wouldn't be able to follow them through there. Jake didn't hesitate. He veered the bike sharply toward the trail, the tires kicking up dirt and dust as they slid onto the path. The girl's breath caught behind him, but Jake didn't slow down. He had no choice. The car was closing in fast, and they didn't have the luxury of taking their time. The trail was rough, the dirt uneven, but Jake pushed the bike faster, his eyes scanning the road ahead. The trees started to close in, their branches brushing against the sides of the bike, but Jake didn't slow. The car couldn't follow them now, not on this narrow trail. But as they rounded a corner, Jake's heart skipped a beat. There, in the distance, he could see a figure moving toward them. A man. Jake's eyes narrowed. He couldn't see who it was from this far away, but he could feel the tension building in his chest. He couldn't risk running into someone else right now, not when they were so close to escaping. The girl shifted behind him, her hand still gripping his waist, her breathing steady but quick. Jake could feel her anxiety, but she didn't say anything. She was waiting for him to act. As they got closer, Jake could see the figure more clearly. It was a man, tall, with a dark jacket, his face obscured by a hood. He was standing in the middle of the path, blocking their way. Jake's mind raced. He had to make a decision fast. The car was still a threat, but now this man was in their way. Jake had no idea who he was or what he wanted, but he wasn't about to let him stop them. He pulled the bike to a halt just short of the man, the tires kicking up dirt and gravel as the bike slid to a stop. The man didn't move, just stood there, his face hidden in the shadow of his hood. For a moment, everything was still. The only sound was the wind rustling through the trees and the faint hum of the engine. Then the man spoke, his voice low and calm. You can't run forever. Jake's heart skipped a beat. The words sent a chill down his spine. He didn't recognize the voice, but the warning was clear. This wasn't over. The man took a step forward, and Jake could see the glint of something in his hand. A gun. Get off the bike, the man said. You're not going anywhere. Jake's muscles tensed, and he instinctively reached for the knife at his side. He wasn't about to give up without a fight, but the odds weren't in his favor. The man was armed, and Jake had no idea what kind of backup he might have. The girl behind him tensed, sensing the danger. Jake, she whispered, her voice tight with fear. Jake turned his head slightly to look at her. Stay down, he said quietly. He needed to keep her out of this. This wasn't her fight. But the man wasn't waiting. He took another step forward, his hand gripping the gun tightly. I said get off the bike, the man repeated, his voice hard. Jake's heart was pounding, but he didn't show any fear. He wasn't going to back down, not now. The man wasn't the only one with something to lose. The man's grip on the gun tightened as he took another step forward, but Jake stood his ground. His mind raced, calculating the odds, weighing his options. He couldn't afford to back down. Not now, not with the girl behind him. Every instinct in his body told him to fight, to take control of the situation before it spiraled further out of hand. But there was something in the man's eyes that made Jake pause. This wasn't just some thug looking to make a quick buck or scare a couple of people off. No, this man was part of something bigger, and Jake knew it. He was getting closer to the heart of the mystery, the truth that had been buried for years. But first, he needed to get out of this alive. The girl's grip on him tightened, and Jake felt the fear emanating from her. He turned his head slightly, enough to see her worried eyes peering over his shoulder. Stay down, he whispered, his voice firm but gentle. The girl nodded, though he could see the uncertainty in her gaze. Jake didn't want to drag her into this any further. This was his fight. But as the man in front of him raised the gun, something inside Jake snapped. He wasn't going to let anyone hurt her. Not now, not ever. I'm not going anywhere, Jake said, his voice steady, his body tense with the need to act. The man's eyes narrowed, and his lips curled into a sneer. You don't have a choice, he said, his finger hovering over the trigger. But before the man could make a move, Jake did what he did best. He acted. With lightning speed, Jake lunged forward, knocking the man's gun hand to the side just as it went off. The shot missed, ricocheting off the nearby rocks, and the man staggered backward, caught off guard. Jake didn't hesitate. He tackled the man to the ground, the gun slipping from his hand as they hit the dirt. The fight was on, raw and brutal. Jake threw punch after punch, his anger fueling him, each blow landing with the weight of years of betrayal and regret. The man struggled beneath him, trying to push Jake off, but Jake's strength was unmatched. He had nothing left to lose. Just as the man reached for a knife at his waist, Jake grabbed his wrist, twisting it, and disarming him in a fluid motion. He pinned the man down with his knee, his breathing heavy, but his grip on the situation secure. You don't want to do this, the man hissed, his eyes wild with fury. Jake didn't respond. He simply held the man down, glaring at him with a fire that said everything. He wasn't backing down this time. The girl, who had been frozen in fear, finally stepped forward, her small voice trembling. Jake, is he? He's not going to hurt anyone, Jake said, never taking his eyes off the man beneath him. He had no idea who this guy was, but he knew one thing. The answers were within reach, and he wasn't going to stop until he had them. The man beneath Jake grunted in frustration, struggling to break free, but Jake held him firmly in place. You're going to tell me everything, Jake said, his voice cold and calm, but with an underlying threat. The man snarled, his eyes darting between Jake and the girl. You really don't know what you're getting into, he spat. You're just pawns in a much bigger game. Jake's heart pounded in his chest. He had been hearing those words too often lately, and they were starting to make sense. This wasn't just about his past or the girl's involvement. There was something more to this, something that reached far beyond what he could have imagined. Then tell me, Jake said, his voice low, his grip tightening. What is it? What do you want with us? The man didn't answer immediately. He was panting, his body still under Jake's weight, and for a moment, Jake thought he might refuse to speak. But then, he looked up, his eyes full of something Jake couldn't quite read. Fear, maybe. They'll come for you, the man said, his voice barely above a whisper. And when they do, You'll wish you never got involved. Jake's stomach tightened at the man's words. Who will come for us? Jake demanded, but the man just smiled grimly, as if to say it didn't matter anymore. You'll find out soon enough, he muttered. Jake's frustration grew. He needed answers, and the man wasn't giving him anything useful. But before Jake could say anything else, the distant sound of another car engine reached his ears. It was too far off to be a threat, but it was enough to make Jake pause. The man's face twisted in fear. They're here, he said quickly, his voice panicked. Jake stood up, his mind racing. The fight was over for now, but the danger wasn't. They had to leave. He grabbed the man by the collar and dragged him to his feet. You're coming with us, Jake said. The man struggled, but Jake's grip was unyielding. He wasn't going to let him go, not until he had the answers. You're making a big mistake, the man said through gritted teeth, but Jake didn't listen. They had to move fast. Jake turned to the girl, his eyes meeting hers. Stay close. We're not safe yet. The girl nodded, fear still in her eyes, but there was a determination there now too. They had been through so much together, and this wasn't the end. Not yet. Jake led the man toward the bike, his senses alert to every sound, every movement around them. They were far from being out of danger, but for the first time in what felt like forever, Jake felt like he had control of the situation. They weren't running anymore. They were taking the fight to whoever was behind all of this. And whatever it took, Jake wasn't going to stop until he uncovered the truth.